Welcome, fellow historical weirdos, to the super short audio thing that I slap onto the start of all my episodes. I'm recording this one during the last months of 2023, and Season 2 is officially underway! Season 2 promises to be just as commercial-free as Season 1, which means that if you want to support this show's continued existence, please consider becoming a patron of Past Peculiarity in exchange for a teeny monthly fee. Doing so will earn you your very own certified historical weirdo plastic medallion. Designed and 3D printed right here in the USA in an actual historian's living room, these medallions are collector's items and are shaped like actual circles. Run a pencil around the edge and draw as many chariot wheels, top-down views of grain silos, closed-mouth Pac-Mans, or outside of yin-yangs as you'd like. And they come with an actual paper certificate with your actual name on it. Go to findyourselfinhistory.com/sponsors to learn more. Subscriptions can be canceled at any time, but medallion and certificate are yours for life and to bequeath to future generations of confused descendants. Thanks, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome back, friendly listener, to this gleaming new podcast about how exploring history opens our eyes to the strangeness of now. I hope you've got your passport ready, because today we're going to be taking a trip to the city of Truro in England, in County Cornwall. Hey, we've landed. Welcome to England. Since you are one of my listeners, you're automatically charming and clever. You therefore quickly become mates, that means friends, with a couple of Truronians, that means people from Truro. They invite you to their flat, that means apartment, for a traditional afternoon meal called a cream tea, a Cornish variation of English afternoon tea. Sure, your mates serve tea the drink, but there's also food, like maybe scones. And these scones are not sweet, like what passes for scones in the United States. You cut the not very sweet scone in half and apply what's called clotted cream to it. Then, because scones are not sweet, your hosts tell you to sweeten them with jam. Since your hosts are Cornish traditionalists, they inform you that you must put the cream on first and the jam only afterwards. Only those weirdos from Devon add the jam first and then the cream. You leave your new mates realizing that you have been downright jammy, that means lucky, to have had this opportunity to enjoy this time-honored and delicious ritual. In fact, English tea has many long-standing traditions and rituals associated with it. So where do you grow tea in England anyway? And when did the ancient art of tea cultivation first begin here? It turns out that tea leaves are harvested commercially in England in a place called Tregathnan, just a few miles down the road from your mate's flat in Truro. And they've been growing this tea in England since all the way back in the year 2005. Yes, that's right. Tea has been growing in England since the iPhone was still 2 full years away from being released. A storied age when a heroic figure named James the Blunt struggled with a mysterious band of Arctic monkeys over who would reign supreme over the UK's singles chart. But you know, come to think of it, 2005 is pretty recent in the big picture. Up until that time, tea, the leafy beverage, had not been grown commercially in the UK at all. Think about that for a second. For centuries, tea has been crucial to what it means to be English, and or British, and or United Kinglish. And for almost all that time, this important symbol of national identity was connected to Britain's dominance over a globe-spanning empire. An empire that connected to and conquered other parts of the world. What's more, part of the reason that tea became popular here in the first place has to do with its connection to sugar, the stuff in the jam that helps you sweeten the non-sweetened scones. Some folks might think of sweetened tea with little pastries as dainty or innocent. But as we'll tease out in today's episode, tea and sugar have their roots in a complex, messy, and sometimes incredibly ugly past. Oh, and hey, I get it. Thinking about the repercussions of your morning beverages can make you feel disorientated. That means disoriented. As if you're whacked out on too much caffeine. But fear not. I'm a professional historian and I'm trained to guide people through situations precisely like yours. My name is Doug Sofer, and I'm a weirdo, just like you. If you're enjoying this podcast, come visit findyourselfinhistory.com/sponsors to learn more about how you can encourage the future existence of this history project. You and I live far from the growing places of many of the foods and drinks we ingest, and we probably don't reflect much about how this situation came to be, or why. Or how seriously odd it must have seemed when these consumable goods showed up in marketplaces and on tables for the first time. Luckily, You Are a Weirdo is the name of this podcast, so you're in the right place to consider this phenomenon. Today's episode is called Your Tea Comes with Baggage. The history of English tea begins even before 2005. Way before, actually. And it starts far away from England, in what's probably the most important commercial area in all of human history, the Indian Ocean trade region. Take a look at a map of the Indian Ocean and you'll see this huge area that goes from eastern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, and then travels east through Persia, modern-day Iran, to the Indian subcontinent, to Southeast Asia, to the Pacific Islands of Indonesia and Malaysia, through the Philippines and east to China and Japan. If geography's not your thing, I'll link up a map on findyourselfinhistory.com to show you what I'm talking about. Either way, you'll see that this region is enormous, something like 4,700 miles between its western and eastern extremes. The Indian Ocean connected most of the world's biggest, richest population centers, and it was easier to navigate than most other oceanic routes because you could hug the coastline for much of it. For that reason, people traveled back and forth throughout these populated places, creating networks of exchange in the process. The earliest networks date back to thousands of years BCE or BC. They exchanged products: silk, incense, gold, cotton, spices, porcelain, fruits, vegetables, opium, tin, silk, manufactured goods, animal products, and many other trade goods. And they also traded ideas. The religious/philosophical tradition known as Buddhism, for example, spread from its birthplace in northeastern India and then throughout Southeast Asia and eventually to China and Japan and beyond. And those Buddhists brought with them this really cool leaf that you could steep in hot water and that seemed to give you energy to get all kinds of work done. The leaves are from a shrubby tree called Camellia sinensis, which is native to an area around Bangladesh and western Burma or Myanmar, and the Brahmaputra River region in far eastern India in the foothills of the Himalaya Mountains. That leaf accompanied Buddhist merchants and others as they traversed thousands of miles throughout Southeast Asia and into China. It was during China's Tang Dynasty, which lasted between the years 618 and 907 AD or CE, that tea became China's favorite beverage. It was popularized by a poet and scholar named Lu Yu, who lived from 733 to 804. Lu Yu had been raised in a Buddhist monastery and wrote a book that became known in China simply as Classic of Tea. The book itself was mostly a manual for tea connoisseurs, including information on how to cultivate, ferment, and store the tea leaves, and then how to prepare the best beverage possible from them. The book is especially useful for our purposes because it demonstrates that critical transition period between when the beverage was new and weird to when it became normal and part of everyday life in China. Authoring the main book on the subject during that time period turned Lu Yu into a major celebrity. A present-day scholar of East Asian languages and culture named James Ben refers to Lu Yu as the patron saint of tea, while the authors of another history of tea assert that because of his tea book, Lu Yu was elevated to the status of demigod. Chinese artisans who made teapots and teacups and other tea-related pottery would throw in a porcelain action figure of Lu Yu for their best customers who had purchased sufficient quantities of tea paraphernalia. Over the next centuries, tea culture continued to develop in China and in Japan. It also spread to new places like Russia and remained important in tea's Himalayan homeland on the Indian subcontinent. Okay, fine, you might be saying, but how did tea ever get to Western Europe and to England? To answer that question, we'll have to excuse ourselves momentarily from our little tea party and investigate the history of trade between the Indian Ocean and its equally wet western counterpart, the Mediterranean Sea. Merchants linked the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean through a series of enormous east-west trade routes that we call the Silk Road. Enterprising traders had been traveling along that route since China's Han Dynasty, which lasted from 206 BC or BCE to 220 CE or AD. During that age, goods traveled to and from places as far away as the Roman Empire, something like 5,000 miles away from China. The general big-picture, low-res version of what came next goes something like this. When the Roman Empire collapsed at the end of the 5th century, Western Europe became more cut off from the world than it had been under a unified Roman state. That isolation is one of the reasons many folks still refer to this period as the so-called Dark Ages. By the end of the 11th century, Western European kingdoms took part in the Crusades, an attempt to conquer, or reconquer in European estimations, Jerusalem and other sites in the Middle East of importance to Christianity. Following some initial successes, Western Europeans set up what were called the Crusader states, 4 Catholic Christian states in the eastern Mediterranean, located in today's Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey. These states stuck around for a couple of centuries, but by 1291 they were all conquered, or reconquered in Persian and North African estimations, by Muslim armies led from Persia and Egypt. Militarily, then, the Crusades didn't succeed in the long run. But culturally and economically, they changed the way that Western Europeans saw themselves in the world. Specifically, the long presence of Europeans and their descendants in the Middle East allowed Western Europeans to get a taste for all kinds of goods produced and traded throughout the Islamic world. Those goods included plant-based consumable products such as sugar and spices, and even some really weird things like coffee, which hailed originally from East Africa and ended up in Yemen, for instance. Trade for some of those goods continued after the Crusader states fell, but that commerce was largely interrupted by the chaos that characterized the late Middle Ages. That period went from about 1300 through 1500, during which Western Europe was plagued by war, and plagued by famine, and plagued by plagues, like the Black Death pandemic. All that plaguing made it harder to maintain business as usual with the rest of the world. A couple of centuries later, the situation finally started to stabilize, and Europeans looked outward to other parts of the world again. That next period, let's call it 1350 to 1600-ish, is known as the Early Modern Era, or the Renaissance. It was a European cultural rebirth, which is what renaissance means. And when it came to rebirthing international trade, Renaissance leaders were hoping to gain the big prize. And that big prize was access to that really lucrative Indian Ocean trade region we were already talking about. You know, the place that already had been trading tea for roughly 1,000 years. Renaissance Europe's thirst for new wealth and new cultural inputs coincided with a new spirit of exploration, discovery, and conquest. One spirited Renaissance man especially interested in exploring and discovering and conquering was Prince Henry of Portugal, who lived from 1394 to 1460. You may have learned of him as Henry the Navigator, even though he never actually navigated a ship. But Henry did fund many ocean voyages. Why? He was trying to see if it was possible to get to the Indian Ocean without having to go through intermediaries in the Islamic world. Look again at that map of the world and you'll see that the Arabian Peninsula, Turkey, Egypt, and Iran are all in between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. Those places were the mightiest states in the Islamic world and forced those who wanted access to Asian trade to work through them. But Henry wanted to go around them all. So where could they go to get to the Indian Ocean? It's clear from that map that taking the long journey around the coast of Africa was the only way to do it, though Christopher Columbus would later propose going east to the Indian Ocean by going west, which it turns out can be done, but which, unbeknownst to Columbus, turned out to be the very, 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 very long way to get to Asia. That miscalculation would inadvertently give Europeans access to a whole new place, called the Americas. Meanwhile, the events that Henry set into motion led Portugal to establish a global network of trading centers. I remember reading when I was younger something about Portugal having set up a network of so-called trading posts, but I don't think that term does justice to what Portugal set up. I don't know about you, but when I think of a trading post, I imagine a charming little wooden shelter by the side of a country road, where some friendly folks are selling homegrown tomatoes or farm-fresh eggs, or some kind of whole-grain, home-baked bread cakey thing. And that's exactly what Portugal had, except that instead of friendly, wholesome folks, they had armed-to-the-teeth sailing vessels sacking competing trading towns and shooting anyone else who got in their way. And instead of a little wooden shelter, they built enormous walled fortifications bristling with cannons to defend their claims. These fortresses/naval bases/trade centers transformed Europe's relationship to global commerce. The first of these places went up in Portugal's Atlantic islands, like the Azores and Madeira. They then built similar fortress facilities in Western Africa. Eventually, Portugal's merchant navy navigated around the entire enormous continent of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, and continued establishing these fortified armed trading encampments in Asia. They established fortress trading centers in Goa in India, and on the island of Sri Lanka, conquering and trading and fortifying as they went. But then in 1513 they got stuck. They had tried to establish a base of operations in China during the Ming Dynasty, but over the next decades they were chased out repeatedly by Chinese forces and lost a conflict with China in 1548. But then in 1554, different Portuguese agents agreed to pay the Imperial Chinese government a whole bunch of silver annually to establish a Portuguese trading zone on the port of Macau. Despite the expense, Portuguese access to Chinese and Indian trade goods, along with food products from the American hemisphere, made Portugal into a global trading juggernaut. In 1569, a couple decades after Portugal had started renting its Macau base of operations, the Dominican friar Gaspar da Cruz published his notes on life in China. And da Cruz's notes include the first ever account of a European drinking a cup of tea. Da Cruz explains in his book that there's a brewed concoction served in homes in China called sha, and that it's red and very medicinal. It's served on a charming tray to any prestigious guests, whether those folks are well known to the people of the home or not. Da Cruz adds that he was offered this cha stuff many times, indicating to his readers that he was, in fact, one of those prestigious guests he'd mentioned. In fact, the word for tea in Portuguese is still cha, and the word for tea in Chinese is pronounced cha, at least if we trust the Google Translate lady. So now, finally, we have clear evidence of a European who drank some tea, and it only took us until 1569, just 830-something short years or so after Lu Yu had helped popularize the drink during the Tang Dynasty. Europe had clearly arrived late to tea time, and the English took even longer to get there than had their continental cousins. It was another 83 years, 1652, when entrepreneurs established the first two coffee houses in England, one in Oxford and another in London. Shortly after the coffee, they started brewing tea in those establishments too, and it was the less popular of the two new hot drinks. But then tea got a huge boost in 1662, when England's King Charles II married Catherine of Braganza. And where do you think she was from? Yes, you guessed it right. She was from Braganza. Oh, and the point is that Braganza is a town on the northeast corner of Portugal. Catherine was young and attractive and all kinds of fancy, and she especially fancied tea. Like the duck-faced pouting influencers of today's social media, Catherine's choice of beverage made tea the it drink in England. But Da Cruz's complaint that it was bitter remained a problem for British consumers to really take to the beverage. The good news, from the perspective of thirsty and hitherto insufficiently caffeinated Brits, was that tea's celeb status coincided with Britain's increasing control over the production and consumption of sugar. And as we're about to see, that may have been the only good news when it came to the sugar trade. Sugar is sweet and associated with innocence, right? Today in the US, we can buy sugar in 10-pound bags for $15. That's cheaper than it is to buy a little jar of imported clotted cream or Cornwall jam in the States. In fact, sugar is so cheap now that businesses give it away for free in little paper packets. But from its earliest history in Europe and in the Americas, the sweet sugar industry brought 3 bitter consequences along with it: plantation slavery, wars, and environmental catastrophe. I realize that the episode becomes a lot less fun at this point, but we simply cannot accurately discuss the sugar industry within any kind of historical context without mentioning slavery. That's because there was a tremendous human price to Portugal's meteoric rise as a world power, a price especially apparent on the continent of Africa. Those trade fortresses that Portugal had established on the African coastline served to destabilize the political scene on some parts of the continent. African states began to compete with each other for access to Portugal's globally traded products, including those coming from some of the wealthiest places in the world in the Indian Ocean trade basin. Portuguese traders deliberately encouraged that competition, which led to more wars between different African societies. In return, Portugal eventually traded with African nations for their war captives, exploiting and distorting already existing markets for people, servants, and other kinds of forced laborers. Those older African systems of forced labor, and there were many different varieties, better resembled what's called classical slavery, the kind in ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, and ancient Rome, than the slave systems of the Americas that would follow. For instance, within the modern-day borders of Ghana in West Africa, historian Akosua Adoma Perby shows that African forms of forced labor often ended up with servants becoming part of extended family units. Over time, manumission, the gaining of one's freedom, was also fairly common in these earlier African systems. And maybe most important, the status of forced laborers wasn't necessarily inherited by future generations. Slavery was more of an individual than a collective condition on the continent of Africa. In short, many, but not all, African categories looked much more like servitude than slavery. This isn't to suggest that forced labor of any kind is somehow pleasant or benign. It's just that not all kinds of forced labor are equal, and most forms in Africa held within them some future hope of freedom or for a better life. By contrast, this new system of slavery that the Portuguese established under their legal system converted African war captives into property. And they would usually be taken off the continent entirely and brought to the Americas. Why? Because Portugal and eventually other European nations too wanted laborers to work their sugar plantations, especially in Brazil and in the islands of the Caribbean Sea. The result of this supply of and demand for human beings was the brutal system known as the Atlantic slave trade, the largest-scale scheme of mass human trafficking the world has seen. And other European countries would take part in this trade too. Less than a century after Portugal had built all of those trading posts/fortresses that we talked about earlier, the Netherlands tried to do the same thing and become a globe-trotting power in its own right. And then France and England followed suit too. Before you knew it, many of those Portuguese fortifications got taken over by Dutch and French and British naval forces. The places under contest became war zones. If you go today to the islands of the Caribbean or to many sites on the coastline of Africa or parts of India, you'll find all these fortresses with rusty old cannons poking out of every place imaginable. And almost all of those cannons point to the sea. They are designed to repel invasion forces coming from foreign navies. From the 16th century through the end of the 1700s, sugar had become the most lucrative agricultural commodity in the world. Fortunes were won and lost fighting for the tropical soils in which sugarcane could grow, especially in the islands and coastal areas on the Caribbean Sea. Caribbean rainforests were clear-cut in that same process. With the intensity of labor required to work sugarcane on a large scale, the Dutch, French, and British adopted Portugal's version of African slavery for themselves and expanded it wherever they grew sugar. Sugar profits therefore led to further competition and international wars between these European kingdoms, not only in the Caribbean over sugarcane soils, but also over control of those West African trading fortifications where human beings continued to be purchased. That perverse trade, in turn, led to even more competition and more wars between African societies to trade with those Europeans for access to their global trade goods, which led to even more human beings, more enemy war captives, to be sold as human property. The whole system continued to reinforce itself, growing larger and larger. And it continued to grow so long as sugar stayed profitable. That situation didn't begin to change until the last decades of the 18th century. Across the English Channel, the French Revolution of 1789 sowed chaos not only in France itself, but also in all of France's colonies around the globe. 2 years later, in 1791, the enslaved people living on the French sugar-producing colony of Saint-Domingue, along with free people of African descent, launched a revolution of their own against the colony's slaveholders. And they won. The Haitian Revolution, as it became known, has its own long and complex history, full of triumphs and tragedies alike. But one of its lasting legacies was making European colonizers think twice about keeping the institution of slavery around. After all, keeping humans captive in a forced labor system meant more overseers, more naval vessels, and more troops to prevent new rebellions. Paying for those measures made the profitability of sugar plantation slavery less sustainable. At the same time, it had become clear that you can also grow perfectly good sugar right in Europe from what are called sugar beets. The price of sugar dropped and made it still harder to justify slavery even on just pure economic grounds. And lastly, increasingly large numbers of Europeans became interested in ideas of human liberation percolating around Europe in the 18th century. More of them than ever started calling for an end to slavery once and for all. Britain's Parliament halted the Atlantic slave trade in 1807. Over the next years, its Royal Navy, which had once defended this commerce in people, began to intercept slave ships and free the captives. Even so, it took until the middle of the 19th century, following multiple other rebellions in the Caribbean, for European countries to officially abolish slavery once and for all. For example, as late as 1831, even though the African slave trade had largely ended, slavery itself remained legal within Britain's sugar colonies. That same year, an enslaved Jamaican named Sam Sharp, a self-appointed Baptist preacher, organized and led a revolt for freedom. It became known to its participants as the Baptist War of 1831. British authorities eventually captured Sharp, imprisoned him, and executed him the next year. But his movement was among the main inspirations for the British Empire abolishing slavery once and for all the next year in 1833. So sugar, this seemingly innocent commodity that cuts the bitterness of tea, and that ends up in the jams that sweeten the scones at tea time, was once a product of multiple European empires. As we've seen, the human cost of developing this product that we now take for granted is difficult to fathom. By taking up the mantle of global empire that the Portuguese had begun, the British Empire embraced what were once new global commodities. Along the way, tea became a symbol of what it was to be British. And whether consumers realized it or not, whether in the past or present, tea and sugar are both part of that complex legacy. We can't complete a conversation about tea and sugar without considering one more famous intersection of those two commodities: sweet tea. In case you haven't spent time in the U.S. South, Like if you're actually from Cornwall, sweet tea is not from the UK at all. It's not served in a teacup, there's no teabag. In fact, it's not even hot. It's pre-sweetened tea, served in a tall glass with ice, and it's pretty much the most important beverage in the US South, with the possible exceptions of beer and whiskey. Sweet tea shows up everywhere, including in all kinds of music from the South. Whether we're talking country, country rock, blues, Americana folk, or alt-acoustic folk Americana country blues rockabilly. Sweet tea is a lyric in multiple country songs. It's the name of an album by blues legend Buddy Guy. You can even buy folksy country stuff made out of wood, or maybe needlepoint sampler wall hangings that say things like, "Raised on sweet tea and country music." A journalist for the magazine Garden and Gun writes in a 2008 article that, "Sweet tea isn't a drink, really. It's culture in a glass, like Guinness in Ireland or ouzo in Greece." In other words, although sweet tea is just sweetened iced tea, it isn't just sweetened iced tea. It's a symbol of identity and part of what it means to be from the South. And not that long ago, it was Russian. Bet you didn't see that coming. No, seriously, I think we can make a case here. I'm looking at a publication from Britain, originally written in the 1830s, about how much Russians are obsessed with ice. Remember that in the 1830s, ice pretty much only came from very cold places. Ice makers and electric freezers were yet to be invented. And Russia was, and is, a famously cold place for much of the year. But its summers could be, and still can be, surprisingly hot. The extremely logical solution then was to store ice in the winter and use it to cool things off in the summer. The article's author, a German travel writer and scholar named Johann Kohl, explains, "An immense quantity of ice is consumed in Russian housekeeping. Throughout the summer, ices are sold in the streets of every Russian town, and not only iced water, iced wine, and iced beer, but even iced tea is drunk in immense quantities." The word "even" there in "even iced tea" suggests something important. Iced tea seemed like a strange concept, at least to this author, in the mid-19th century. A couple of decades later, in 1851, in fact, an English publication edited by none other than Charles Dickens himself quoted this same exact German author's observation about how very odd it was that Russians drank iced tea. The tea described there is iced, but not necessarily sweet. So I went looking for more references to so-called Russian tea, and found some that were sweet, but not necessarily iced. The whole search got very confusing very quickly. That's because the term Russian tea shows up in all kinds of English-language cookbooks in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But the concept of Russian tea in both the UK and US during that time ends up working a lot like other kinds of food names that are only sort of related to the countries we claim them to be from, like French toast, or Belgian waffles, or Russian dressing, or French dressing, or Italian dressing. Hey, why do Americans have an obsession with pretending that our salad dressings come from other countries anyway? And why isn't there an American dressing? Those all may be fine questions, but this episode is not called "Your Salad Sauce Confuses Me," so we'd best move on. The point is that the connections between some foods and the countries they purportedly hail from are tenuous at best. The same is true with Russian tea, which for most of the English-speaking world seems to have briefly meant tea made with lemon and sometimes with sugar in it. So why Russian? Well, it turns out that Russian tea connection is legit. Generally speaking, Russians love their tea. The first Russian contact with the beverage probably came in 1616, just a half-century after the first mention of tea by Portuguese sources. By 1674, just a decade after Catherine of Braganza had started pushing tea to the Brits, tea also became a luxury drink available in large quantities in Moscow via Chinese trade. And also, like England, it became popular for Russians from many walks of life in the early decades of the 1700s. And yet again, a big part of tea's success in Russia only came through its sweetening through sugar. So where did the Russians get their sugar? At first they got it from the British, among others. You may remember from school that the British used a bunch of semi-government, semi-private chartered trading groups. The most famous of these were the British East India Company and the Virginia Company. Maybe you've also heard of the Royal African Company. Yet another one of those enterprises was called the Russia Company, and it traded a lot of different British Empire goods with Russia, including sugar. The fact that Russia did not have tropical overseas colonies meant that tea drinkers had to import sugar through Western Europe, or they sometimes used honey instead. But remember those sugar beets we talked about earlier? By the end of the 1700s, Russian landowners and farmers started growing them. A lot of them. By the end of the 1800s, the Russian Empire went from importing Western European sugar to being an exporter of sugar. And as Russian beet sugar became more available, a new tradition of drinking sweetened tea emerged that's still practiced by some folks today. It goes like this. You take a sugar cube, hold it between your teeth, and sip your tea, dissolving the cube in your incisors as it flows by. Somewhere out there, your dentist has just started weeping. Okay, so we have all the ingredients of sweet tea now. Tea? Check. Sweetness? Check. But how did the concept get to the United States and to the South? That part's not entirely clear. Most reliable sources I've looked at agree that the first written evidence of Southern iced tea may have come as late as 1879 in a cookbook called Housekeeping in Old Virginia. Select parts of that recipe read, after scalding the teapot, put into it 1 quart of boiling water and 2 teaspoonfuls of green tea. Strain, without stirring, through a tea strainer into a pitcher. Fill the goblets with ice, put 2 teaspoonfuls granulated sugar in each, and pour the tea over the ice and sugar. Wait, but why green tea? Because green tea was cheap and plentiful by 1879, and that's because the United States was up to its own flavor of empire building, somewhat similar to what the British were up to elsewhere in the world. A few decades before, in 1852, Commodore Matthew Perry brought a small fleet of new cutting-edge steam-powered warships to Japan. Mounted on the ships were the first generation of French cannons known as the Pexon guns, named after their French inventor. These guns fired large explosive artillery shells and could easily obliterate traditional wooden ships. Perry told Japanese authorities, who at the time had access mostly to pre-industrial weaponry, that they had a year to sign a treaty that would open up their ports to U.S. trade, or suffer the consequences. This episode in so-called gunboat diplomacy would have all kinds of implications for U.S., Japanese, and world history. But for our purposes, it means that after the treaty was finalized in 1854, Japanese green tea flooded U.S. markets. And that's why what many writers claim as the first recipe for Southern sweet tea calls for green tea only. But hang on, is that really the first recipe for sweet tea? The answer, it turns out, is definitely not. I found at least one from 4 years earlier, 1875. Folks might have missed it because the author of this cookbook refers to it simply as cold tea. Excerpts of this recipe go like this. Mixed tea is better cold than either black or green alone. When ready to use it, you must fill a goblet 3/4 of the way to the top with clear tea. Sweeten it more lavishly than you would hot, and fill up the glass with cracked ice. It is a delicious beverage in summer. This 1875 sweet tea formula was published in London, and it's by an author named Marion Harland, M-A-R-I-O-N, often a man's name. For that reason, I had this whole thing ready to go in my head about how maybe that book means that some British dude, along with the Russians, really invented Southern sweet tea, and how we therefore have to re-examine all kinds of other underlying assumptions. Like maybe Southern biscuits are really from Quebec, or New England clam chowder is really from Burkina Faso, or maybe Yorkie dogs are actually ferrets in disguise, and so on. But it turns out that we know something about Marion Harland, which was actually a pen name for a very talented and prolific author named Mary Virginia Terhune, who lived from 1830 to 1922. Those rooting for a classic Southern origin story to sweet tea will not be disappointed. Her name has Virginia in it, for crying out loud. And she actually was from Virginia. Amelia County, south of Richmond, to be precise. None of this northern Virginia that's practically Washington, D.C. business. And best of all, Amelia County is very, very country. There's something like 13,000 people in the whole county today. And she was married to a minister. And then she moved to Newark, New Jersey. Okay, that last place isn't southern at all. But stick with me here. They clearly loved her not only in rural Virginia, but also in Jersey and New York City. In 1871, she became the first president of the New York YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association. And her obituary in the New York Times from 1922 refers to her as a homemaking genius, right in the headline. It turns out she was a powerhouse of an author who had been a published writer since she was 14 years old. She wrote something like 24 novels, nearly the same number of nonfiction books. A 490-page autobiography that a New York Times reviewer gushed over, calling it a book of infinite charm, and has in it a spirit as young as that of the author's lovely girlhood. Yeah, they definitely don't write book reviews like that anymore at the Times. Either way, I think her 1875 recipe for mixed black and green tea that sweetened more lavishly than regular hot tea is an even better origin story for Southern sweet tea than the 1879 one. Today, tea is just an assumed part of daily life for billions of people around the globe. One trade site connected to the tea industry estimates that in 2018, there were 5.89 million tons produced of the stuff worldwide. An especially impressive quantity when you realize it's basically just a lightweight, dried-out leaf. And as we've seen, you can't really talk about tea without mentioning sugar, too. And you can't mention sugar without acknowledging the historic human cost that came with producing it. At its worst, these two commodities were part of a number of unpalatable processes connected to imperial wars of conquest and to human trafficking on an unprecedented scale in the form of the Atlantic slave trade, and to gunboat diplomacy in the name of forcing open formerly closed foreign markets to trade. Yet it also led to greater connections between the people of the earth than ever before, and in surprising ways. It linked, and continues to link, folks from India and Bangladesh to people from China, and Japan, and Russia, and of course the United Kingdom, and to your new imaginary Cornish mates. And it ultimately became the beverage of choice for Southern Americans, especially those Southern Americans trying to avoid beer or whiskey. In fact, tea's role in the anti-alcohol temperance movement is a whole nother story, possibly worthy of a future episode. So how does knowing all of this help us? Does it get you to look at your sweetened cup of tea differently? And should it? But it's not my job to answer those questions. You need to tackle them yourself. But I'd love to hear what you come up with. So you're cordially invited to drop a comment or two at findyourselfinhistory.com. But at the very least, knowing this history helps us understand that tea and sugar are not products that we've just magically had access to forever. This history once again shows us that some of the most normal aspects of our normal lives were not always so normal. No matter where you're from, grasping this context is part of understanding who we are as humans, and how the global social, cultural, and political landscape continues to be shaped by these historical legacies. In our next episode, we meet people online. We hang out with them for hours at a time. We think we know them. By the standards of the past, we connect in all kinds of strange new ways to other humans, creating new friends and new communities, new comrades in arms and games, even while knowing that some of them might not even be people at all. How have concepts of community changed over both space and time? Subscribe to or follow this podcast, or otherwise stay tuned to find out. You can find references to the historical sources, audio clips, and other cool stuff used for this and other episodes at findyourselfinhistory.com. This podcast episode was researched, written, edited, recorded, and mixed by Doug Sofer. All materials are copyright 2023 Doug Sofer. The theme song was written and performed by Doug Sofer with Matt Trimbley on rhythm guitar. You can find more about Matt at trimbley.com. Thanks to everyone for listening.